Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. According to US founding father Benjamin Franklin, nothing is certain except death and taxes. The history of tax reform in Australia has been marked mainly by inaction, sadly. The 3 episodes of successful reform, income tax unification in 42, Paul Keating's 85 reforms, and of course Costello's 2000 new tax system that introduced the GST, are the outliers in a landscape notably absent of policy bravery. Bracket creep debates over direct and indirect taxes and vertical fiscal equalisation have been features of our taxation system for over 80 years. Joining me to discuss the history of tax reform in Australia is Paul Tilley. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Paul.
Thank you, Georgina. Lovely to be here.
And lovely to have you over in Melbourne from Canberra. And, of course, here to teach a bit of tax policy to some very lucky law students.
Yeah, 5 days straight, like a 1-week intensive, so it's pretty confronting.
So, Paul, I'll get right into it. And I appreciate that this is a topic overladen with jargon. And I have been a lawyer and a diplomat, and I did study economics, but I wouldn't say that I am a tax expert. I'm an expert in paying it, I always feel, but not an expert in a lot of the jargon. So we might try and unpack a lot of the jargon for our audience who is less familiar with all of that. But tell me, why is it important that we know about the history of tax reform in Australia?
Well, I guess it's a sort of a feeling that a lot of people in the debate now, and certainly what I observe working with government for 30 years, that a lot of people in the debate, in those discussions, don't have a good sense of history. Now, a lot of the time it doesn't matter that much, but sometimes it matters a lot, actually, when you're making the same mistakes. And I guess I felt partly I was one of those people that often I did feel a sense of inadequacy of not having a good grasp of the history on the issues I was advising on. So it was a bit of an issue that when I sort of left working with government that, well, I've got a bit of time now, I can maybe try to fill some of those holes for future, policy practitioners. Now, in this case, it's tax. I kind of wrote the book for a broader reason. It's not a history of the Australian tax system, it's a history of Australian tax reform. So I was trying to unpack what are the kind of political economy issues that lie behind a reform working or not working. And I'd sort of seen some of that in my own career. I'd studied some of that, and I just wanted to sort of explore that to see if I could do something useful for future advisors and people in the debate.
Given that the history of Australian tax reform is mainly a history of not doing very much, and I mean, maybe it's different in other countries, but that's certainly the experience here in Australia. I mean, it's difficult, right?
It's difficult.
You're changing the goalposts, and people make economic decisions and businesses make economic decisions based on the law as it is, the tax system as it is, and changing that really can be very disruptive. So you can understand that. But understanding the history and having that context must be essential, because you can chart, well, this has been tried before, or this has never been attempted, or what reform was successfully implemented, and these were the arguments that led to that success, and this is how you convince the Australian public to adopt that change. All those things, if you don't have the history, I mean, you're wasting all that experience, aren't you?
That's right. And of course, you have to work out when the history's a key part of it and when it's not. But the dedication to the book, when I was thinking about this and about how hard tax reform is and why is it that we've had, I wouldn't say we've had a lot of failures, but we've had a lot of only partial successes. We've set out to do something big and we've only partially managed that. Sometimes we've taken a step backwards. There's the 3 that you mentioned in the introduction, but when I was thinking about dedication to the book, what I came up with is, to all would-be tax reform is hard, but take courage, for the benefits can be great. Now, that's paraphrasing George Bernard Shaw. His life wasn't meant to be easy, which Malcolm Fraser used that phrase and felt badly done by, because he used the whole phrase, but he just got tagged with the life wasn't meant to be easy, because what the phrase goes on to say is, but take courage, for it can be delightful. And that was my sense of tax reform, is that it is hard. So is it worth it? Well, there's a lot at stake here. The tax system is basically part of the social contract between citizens and their government.
Yes.
So we give you the right to govern us and to tax us, but we expect representation, you to take care of our interests. And So there's a social contract, and if that breaks down, if you lose that sense of taxpayer morality, which has happened at times in our history, you lose a lot. And then the other aspect of it is that taxes in Australia is about 30% of GDP, Commonwealth and state and local. Now, so that's 30% of the economy. So you're trying to take about $800 billion and transfer it from the private sector to the public sector. There's a lot of economic dislocation in there. So there's just a lot at stake in terms of social equity. There's a lot at stake in terms of the economy. So that's why tax reform matters, even though it is hard. We cannot leave it in the too hard basket. You can for a while, but eventually it will catch up with you.
Before we get on to the history, I wonder if you could define what is good tax reform. What is the outcome we're wanting?
Well, I don't think it's hard to get two economists to agree on anything, and certainly not that particular question. But I guess there's some things you could say are broadly accepted and some things are more contentious or debated. And where the way sort of tax economists or public finance people will come at it is to say, well, let's try to frame up some broad criteria by which we could all agree we should assess a tax. And the big three are efficiency, equity, simplicity in the tax world. So we need something that's relatively efficient. It's not causing too much damage to the economy as we transfer that $800 billion from the private sector to the public sector. We need something that the community will broadly think is fair. Now, that doesn't mean everyone just agrees, but if you have a broad sense, okay, I don't like paying my taxes, but look, as long as everyone's paying, they would sort of go along with it. You look at the PAYE system, the pay-as-you-earn, the basic personal income tax that wage and salary earners pay and small business pay, that gets done reasonably seamlessly. Now, it's a complex thing, but so there's a sense of, okay, this is sort of broadly fair. I think other aspects, not so. And simplicity. How much time are we taking? Are we forcing people to spend, small businesses and big businesses in particular, but individuals to some extent, in complying with their tax obligations? So you'd start there and then try to chunk it down to see, well, where does that... And it gets you to certain places that we can go into.
So starting at the beginning of Australia, as we know it today, 1901, what was the tax system like at that stage?
I mean, obviously, there's a lot of history before 1901,
Absolutely.
But the Federation came together at that point, and this is when we transitioned from being governed directly by the UK to having our own constitution and establishment of the Federation. So it's kind of a story of a developing economy transitioning to a developed economy.
And I think that's worth reminding people. I mean, Australia hasn't always been the 12th largest economy in the world, a very much OECD country, a major middle power, an extremely affluent society relative to the rest of the world. We were a developing economy.
Yeah, we were. And so when a starting point in tax design is to tax what you can measure, you have to be able to measure it in order to tax it. Now, okay, back then, if you go back to the pre-Federation years, so income was a funny concept. It's just the natural tax base now, but it was not back then. They couldn't really measure income. It was hard to get a handle on a person's income, even a business's income. So we used things like customs and excise, trade was an easy one. When something crosses a border, we have to do something at that point anyway. We've got to clear it for customs purposes so we can attach a levy. Something like land was reasonably measurable, so we had land taxes. So that's really what we had at that point. Customs and excise were the dominant tax. So as we come into the 20th century and Australian economy is becoming more advanced, more sophisticated, accounting systems are becoming more sophisticated, we can start to measure things like income and even consumption. And so they become bigger taxes. And that's the story of a country transitioning from a developing economy to a developed economy. You move to these more sophisticated tax bases where you can apply your broader criteria of equity, efficiency, simplicity more naturally than you can to something really crude, just like a sort of a customs duty or a land tax or an agricultural levy. So that's the nature of this transition.
So the reason why our tax system at that stage, 1901, around Federation, was customs and excise and land taxes was really because that was the only way you could reliably and fairly and simply levy a tax. Otherwise, you were basically guessing if it was income or other forms of tax.
The tax design principle number one is to tax what you can measure. And if you need a fair bit of revenue, then try to tax something that's in plentiful supply. So trade was just the obvious one. Stamp duties were another one, where it's where there was something else happening. There's another government activity happening, like your stamp duties. That the word of stamp duty comes from, originally that was the government's stamp on a contract, authorising a contract. And so the government would say, oh, well, we're doing something here. Let's get a bit of tax while we're at it. Same as customs duty.
And it was easy to measure. There was a transaction.
Easy to measure. We knew the price.
We put a stamp on it. We can put a charge on that.
Some famous examples going back of governments trying to find ways, things you can measure. The famous window tax in the UK. They were trying to get a measure of wealth, and they came to a view eventually that the number of windows in a house was a proxy for wealth. So you paid your tax depending on the number of windows. But of course, what happened? People were just blocking the windows.
Yeah. Well, tax minimisation, whether it's evasion or avoidance, I guess is down to the lawyer's argument in the courts, but tax minimisation is as old as time.
That's the way markets work.
Yeah,
I mean, a tax is a price.
Yeah. So the first income tax, Commonwealth income tax, that was introduced in
1915.
In 1915. So how was the Commonwealth able to introduce that? What happened around then that led it to make that big decision, really?
It's a fascinating story, and it's the story of the unfolding of the Federation. So the colonies all had some form of income tax prior to Federation. Not much prior, but in the late 19th century, they were introducing kind of crude versions of income taxes. So when we federated, income tax was a state tax, not Commonwealth. Commonwealth just had customs and excise. Come the First World War, the first great challenge.
Just jump in there, Paul. Were people reporting their income to the colonial governments then? Was there some sort of...
Yep, that's correct. They had to...
Revenue office or...
They all had a revenue office, because this year is the bicentenary of the colonial Treasury, in fact, which is now the New South Wales Treasury. To 1824 they were established, and each of the other colonies, as they established government, they established their own colony constitutions, and then their own government apparatus, including revenue collecting authorities. And that consisted of customs was their big one. But come Federation, they agreed to give that to the Commonwealth, customs duty to the Commonwealth, and they keep the rest, including income tax. Income tax was not a big revenue raiser, but it was there. It was quite limited. But as the Federation unfolds, the states thought the deal was that the Commonwealth had customs, states had all the other taxes. But come the First World War, the first great crisis the Federation we face as a nation, the Commonwealth says, well, we need more revenue. Income tax is now a significant revenue raiser, so they introduce an income tax in addition to the states. So now you have both the Commonwealth and the states both levying income tax. Now, the Commonwealth kept that income tax after the war, even when the war finance needs recede, they keep the income tax. So between the two world wars, we've got income tax at both the Commonwealth and the state level. And this is becoming an increasing problem for taxpayers, especially businesses operating across state borders. So you've got to deal with at least 2 tax authorities, maybe up to 7, depending on how extensive your business in Australia is. So it's a major problem, and there's significant attempts to try to resolve that. One of these ones where everyone could work out we should unify income tax, just have it at one level or the other. Everyone kind of basically agreed that. They just couldn't agree which level. The states wouldn't give it up, and the Commonwealth wouldn't give it up. And so come the Second World War, this is the unfold, we go through the Great Depression, when we introduce wholesale sales tax at the Commonwealth level. And then we get to the Second World War, the Commonwealth introduces payroll tax, but its revenue needs are really accelerating, especially after Japan enters the war. And so the Commonwealth goes to the states and says, we need you out of the way of income tax because we need unfettered access to finance the war effort. The states say no. You shouldn't even be in this space in the first place. There's a big showdown. The Commonwealth wins the showdown and forces the states out of income tax, promised to give it back after the war, by the way, reneged on that, and has kept income tax ever since as a monopoly.
So those great national crises are where you've seen those big, big tax changes. But tell me, Paul, and I could be incorrect here, but my impression is in the United States do levy different taxes, different income taxes and various state taxes. But in Australia, that was considered not the preferred option, that there was, as you say, general agreement that there should be a uniform rate of tax across Australia for income tax. And why do you think the states went down a different road and Australia's gone for the sort of just keep it all simple and I guess make the administration for everyday citizens much easier?
So I should just declare an interest here. I'm a 30-year-long Commonwealth Treasury official.
Yeah.
Well, I did move around, including I worked at Victorian Treasury for a couple of years. But the kind of the mentality from the sort of Commonwealth level in Australia is that if you give the tax base to the states, they'll compete against themselves and erode that tax base. So the Commonwealth gave the states payroll tax, for example, in 1971. Now, they maintained uniformity for a period of time, then they started competing, and now payroll tax is a much eroded tax. So the view is that if you let the states have access to the tax base, they will probably compete amongst themselves and erode the base. Whereas if you have it at the national level, at least you know that you've got the one set of legislation applying to all businesses and individuals in Australia. Now, you're right, the US does do it differently, and they do have income tax both the state and the Commonwealth level, and it seems to work quite fine there. Malcolm Fraser offered the states to take back income tax. Robert Menzies investigated that but did not take that step. He had a tax review to look at it, the Spooner Committee, I think it was. So it's an option. You could go either way, but the Australian way has been we've had income tax just at the Commonwealth level.
And why was income tax considered a good tax to levy at that time, I guess in World War I and then sort of doubling down in World War II? Was it considered more lucrative than the customs and excise and the land taxes that have been levied in the past?
Yeah, it goes back to how do you frame a good tax? And if you start with those big three criteria, efficiency, equity, simplicity, it takes you down the path of income tax. Things like customs and excise, they're good revenue raisers. They're relatively simple. Excises, the consumption taxes, a GST. The thing that they lack is the equity dimension that a lot of people are looking for. If you accept the argument that higher income earners, more wealthy people should pay not just more dollars tax, but a higher percentage, if you accept that progressivity argument, then income tax gives you the ability to do that. You can measure someone's income, well, then you can apply different tax rates on different levels of income. And it goes fundamentally how that debate played out was through the ability to pay lens. There was a big debate. Should we think about a benefit type lens, as in you pay taxes in line with the benefits you get from government, or an ability to pay, as in we disconnect the benefits you get and we tax you merely on your ability to pay. And over time, the ability to pay lens held sway, not just in Australia, this is across the world. And we went down income as the one that was the best able to deliver on that.
The notion of progressivity of a taxation system, was that developed as soon as we were introducing income tax in 1915 at a Commonwealth level, or was it earlier than that with the state income taxes?
That concept's been there all along. I mean, if you track the tax axioms sort of back, you get back to Adam Smith in 1776 and then others at the time, there was always a sense that either through the benefit principle or the ability to pay, the sense that high income earners should pay more tax. The benefit principle, before we had broad-based, social welfare systems, government was largely about protecting the property rights of landowners. So there was a sense, well, they're the ones that are getting the big benefit from government, so they should pay more tax. So that was always there, and the ability to pay lens took you down there. Now, that was there right back. The original colonial taxes, income taxes, actually only applied at very high income levels, many multiples of average earnings. And so it was always a sense this was your lever to apply progressivity in the tax system.
And how was that applied in the Australian context? These days, we're all familiar with this tax-free threshold, and I know there are debates over whether that is fit for purpose today or not, but that was introduced quite early on, wasn't it? And I think it was that the average income earner didn't even need to pay income tax until World War II as well. So,
That's right.
In the early stages of income tax levied by the Commonwealth, you've only got the higher income earners who are even paying it at all.
Yeah, the sense was that the general population were paying their taxes through things like customs duties or excises, And so income tax was to supplement that. It was only for the very high income earners. Like I say, it did not apply to average earners. What happened in World War II, the demand for revenue was such they had to extend income tax down to people on average earnings. It became a mass revenue raiser. So you can only do that if you extend it down to a lower income because you need a large number of people. Even wealthy people, there's not enough, there's small numbers. You just don't get the really big revenue. You've got to get it into middle income earners.
And was the sense back then, World War One, Great Depression, World War Two, period of massive disruption and obviously very serious security challenges to Australia, was the sense that you just have to pay for the safety of Australia, the safety of the empire or the allies, that this is just something, a burden we all have to shoulder? Yeah.
It's interesting, Georgina, when we're looking through the Menzies Institute, before some of the history and we're talking about the language. Like in this book I read, a lot of the parliamentary debates around budgets I was focusing on, but you see it, the grand language of prime ministers like Menzies and Chifley talking about this great national emergency, this great national cause. And the sense was that there was no beating around the bush about, we're not really raising taxes. They were saying we need a lot more revenue. We are raising taxes enormously. And when you look at the tax to GDP ratios, it just goes up at a huge, well above 50% of GDP in World War II. Now, it comes back afterwards, but that was this, we're all in this together. Everyone's got to pay, and that's what happened. Now, in some ways, the sort of interesting story is that what happened after the war and when the crisis passed, you think, then we go back to where we were. But that's not what happened. You look at First World War, Great Depression, Second World War, 3 crises where the tax burden was raised significantly. There was some reversion after that crisis, but not back to pre-crisis levels.
So the Menzies era starts again in 49 and runs to 66. And of course, this is a period of great post-war reconstruction, the huge immigration program, the golden era of economic growth, incomes were up. You had the inflation spike with the Korean War, of course, which was an economic crisis. But in terms of the tax reform driven by the Menzies government, and Arthur Fadden is a long-term treasurer through that period, what were the distinct achievements, if any?
It's a really interesting period of time because the sort of central hypothesis in my book is about crisis often drives reform. For politicians to do something really big, a big reform, they need a big burning platform. You need to be able to say there's something seriously wrong here.
Yeah.
We need to do something about it. Now, if you look at that post-war period through the 50s and 60s, there kind of wasn't any burning platform. We had this incredible level of social, economic, political stability, the golden years. There wasn't a burning platform, and so there's no great economic reforms in that period. Not to say that things weren't happening. There were lots of little things happening. This is something I didn't know till I did the book. We're used to sort of governments announcing tax cuts every year, but all they're really doing is giving back bracket creep. And we kind of know that, but they get away with it. So between 1954 and 1970, which covers a lot of that Menzies-Fadden period, there's not a single change in the personal income tax scale.
Oh,
it's
right.
Extraordinary.
So bracket creep just,
15 years of bracket creep.
Yeah.
Now, inflation was low. This is a period of economic stability. We don't have rampant inflation, but even low inflation and low wage growth over 15 years drives a lot of bracket creep. And so what you see, if you look at the tax to GDP story, the size of government story, it just gradually increases through that period. No big crisis, no big ratcheting up, but a steady increase up to about the levels we have today. So by the time we get to the 70s, Commonwealth government's about 25% of the economy, about 25% of GDP. And that's what happened, that steady bracket creep. So everything just stayed the same, basically.
And is this the first time when bracket creep becomes quite a feature of, I guess, a way of the federal government increasing its revenue by stealth?
Well, we didn't talk about it in that way.
Right.
When I look back at the speeches...
So the term bracket creep isn't used back then?
No. It starts to get used in the late 60s, early 70s, when we hit the high inflation period, and then we get the OPEC oil price spikes and we get, the whole stagflation story. So through the 70s, now everyone's talking about bracket creep because we've got inflation above 10%. it's a huge issue. And then you've got the Whitlam government. There's a big increase in government spending, and that's funded by bracket creep. So there's a lot of talk then. In fact, there's a big review in the mid-1970s called the Matthews Review. Russell Matthews specifically looking about what to do about the impact of inflation on the tax system and whether we should index the tax system. Recommended we should do it, and the Fraser government, the Whitlam government didn't do it, but the Fraser government did do it.
At that time, I guess we're getting out of the Menzies era. Are we seeing the Australian tax system heavily reliant on income tax as opposed to, say, the customs and excise? And this was a period when it's quite a lot of protection in the economy, so you would have got quite a bit from tariff revenue. But then company tax as well, was that much of a contributor to the government revenue?
Mainly personal income tax, but company tax is part of the story as well. What you see in that sort of Second World War, when the Commonwealth takes over income tax, they raise income tax to help fund the war effort. And so income tax then overtakes customs duty as the main revenue in Australia. And then through that period, the 50s and 60s, the 54 to 70 period with the bracket creep working away, income tax is becoming more and more dominant until personal income tax gets to about half of total Commonwealth tax revenue. And it's been about half since. For the last 50 years.
Still about half today.
About half today. And it's remarkable. The last 50 years, personal income tax has been about half. It goes up and down each year. The one that's more volatile is company income tax. I think it might be about 20%, 25% of Commonwealth tax revenue. But it goes up and down depending on business cycles and mining booms and recessions. But they have become the dominant. So they're like 3/4 of Commonwealth tax revenue now.
And is there a sense that Australia is too reliant on personal income tax? And I guess you look at other comparative countries, OECD countries. I mean, is that a particular feature of Australia's economy and tax system?
Yeah, I think this is probably about the point, Georgina, where tax economists depart and the uniformity sort of breaks down. I would say not. I'm okay with half. I think it's because it's the tax, it's our broader space tax. It gives you the different governments the ability to satisfy the equity, efficiency, simplicity things most completely. Now, if it was to increase further, then I think that kind of would be a problem. In Australia, our share of our total tax revenue in income tax is higher than most OECD countries. So, okay, you've got to be aware of that. But I think the concern, and someone like Ken Henry would talk about, the concern is that when you look ahead, some of the other tax bases are not looking very good. They're looking very vulnerable. Company income tax is looking very vulnerable in a global economy. Something like fuel excise, as we transition to EVs, it's going to dissipate. So there's other tax bases that are going to fade. And if income tax is left to do more of the heavy lifting, and especially going forward, if we have a smaller proportion of the population of working age, then you might have a bigger tax burden falling on a smaller proportion. Now, that's a worrying scenario.
And that's an intergenerational debate too. And we have, of course, these intergenerational reviews, isn't it?
We do the intergenerational report. So
every few years. I mean, they're fascinating.
Every 4 years,
and they are a bit of, every time they're released, you go, oh God, that's right, with ageing population, and with an ageing population, greater expenditure on healthcare, on aged care, and those government services.
The pressures are enormous.
The NDIS as well has been a huge government program. And then as the population ages, we have that ever diminishing number of people working and earning money and paying tax. If we're 50% reliant on their income tax to fund all these things, then the burden gets greater and greater on those who are working as hard as they can.
Yeah, so Ken Henry launched my book, the book Mixed Fortunes, The History of Tax Reform. And in the speech, he's talking about the intergenerational tragedy. He's looking forward. And what he was saying is we go back to the first of those intergenerational reports, which was 2002, when he was Secretary of Treasury. Peter Costello is Treasurer. They put out the first intergenerational report. So we're now, and they're forecasting 40 years ahead. Now, seriously long forecasting. Unreliable, but at least have a go. We're now kind of halfway through that, a bit over halfway through, and Ken's saying, well, we're basically exactly where we thought we would be 20 so years down the track. So that is a worrying scenario. Now, where it takes you is to say, well, okay, if company tax is vulnerable, if fuel excise is vulnerable, where are the tax bases of the future? And that's really where the tax reform debate goes.
So before we get to the future, which I have a huge interest in as a middle-aged woman working full-time, paying what I think is a lot of tax, I'm interested in where the future's going and who'll be looking after me in my retirement and hopefully good hospitals and aged care and the like, and not a broke economy. We did have some significant reforms that I flagged in the introduction, of course, in the Hawke era. And this is really significant era, not just in Australia, but across the OECD in terms of the massive structural reforms across developed economies. You know, of course, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, those administrations are driving very much sort of economically liberal agendas, small government, low taxes, free trade. But tell me about these Hawke government reforms driven by, of course, Treasurer Paul Keating.
Yeah, so in front of the book I feature three pairs of Prime Ministers and Treasurers. So first of all, Curtin Chifley, where we talked about in the Second World War the income tax unification. The second big partnership is in the 1980s, Hawke and Keating. So they come in, and what's happened is that through that post-war period, with no burning platform, everything is going well until we hit this very high inflation environment and we have an economy and a tax system that's just not fit for purpose when it comes to a high inflation environment and becoming very uncompetitive internationally. And so they sort of decide we need a big economic reform program. We know that story about deregulation of the financial sector. Tariff reductions are a huge part of that story and incredibly painful for parts of the population and industry. But tax is one of the bits that they have a go at. And there was a big review in 1975, the Asprey Review, which laid out a complete blueprint for the Commonwealth tax system. And that was consistent with reviews around the world. The Carter Commission in Canada, two big US Treasury reviews, the Mead Review in the UK, all saying the same thing, basically, all looking at similar tax systems, narrow bases, so especially not effectively taxing capital gains, not taxing fringe benefits, not dealing with expenses properly, not taxing foreign income, not taxing company profits very well. So some are double taxed, some are not taxed at all. So the mantra is to broaden the base and lower the rates. So let's tax it all, but we'll tax it all only once, and that will enable us to substantially lower the tax rate. So on the income tax side, they introduced a capital gains tax, a fringe benefits tax, a foreign tax credit system, a dividend imputation system. These are massive reforms. Now, they tried to do a GST as well, but that fell over at the tax summit. But on the income tax side, it was that big base broadening. And that was consistent with their their broader economic reforms that they were undertaking.
And how was that sold to the Australian public? I mean, was this burning platform that was put forward in the 70s, but we're 1985, I think it was. So,
well, it just goes, I think you've got to say the power of Keating as an orator. I'm going to get to Costello in a minute, but these individuals do have the ability to carry a public debate, and it's incredibly difficult. And they've got a lot of people lined up against you, but Keating just kept making the argument, this is what we have to do to bring Australia into this century, to make it a modern economy. And our Hawke was backing him, and that cabinet was largely backing him, not over the GST bit. They didn't back him on that. But we did have the backing of Hawke in particular. And that partnership got us through. But then next thing, there's another crisis. And then, of course, if there's not a crisis, Keating makes one up. That's where the Banana Republic thing comes from. Oh, there's a burning platform. We're going to be a Banana Republic. Oh, we need another round of reform. And they just carried that debate. They deserve a lot of credit for that.
And, I mean, by the early 90s, we were in recession. Was there public backlash to these reforms? Was this considered, Hawke and Keating's fault? They've driven this reform agenda, and now look at us where interest rates got well into the high teens at one point, didn't they? Yeah. And unemployment was pretty nasty as well. It was a lot of businesses went bust. Did people just accept that as, well, it's the pain we've got to go through to avoid being a banana republic?
No, I don't think so. I think that debate had a lot of that had played out in the sort of mid to late 80s, the big reform debate. By the time you get to that early 90s recession, this is a worldwide phenomenon. It's not peculiar in Australia, but the way we managed it.
We don't ever think of ourselves as part of a global set of trends, do we? I mean, economists might, but in terms of the everyday Australian, we think everything is uniquely us, that our interest rate suddenly went up. We're recovering from COVID. No one else in the world could possibly be experiencing these same things. This is just all about Australia.
No, and it comes down to how you manage it individually. And the sense was that they didn't, I don't know, Keating used that phrase, this is the recession we had to have. And that's an unfortunate phrase, obviously, but in a sense, the breaking of inflation, he claimed it as a legacy. Now, there's a lot of other factors there, but I think generally people think that they got the interest rate policy wrong, and this is all predating independence of the Reserve Bank, because this time it really is Keating and Treasury calling the shots with the Reserve Bank together on interest rates. But a lot of those bigger economic reforms are kind of behind them then. And certainly once you've had the recession, then I think it's all over for the Hawke-Keating government, basically. Now, they did win the 1993 election, the losable election for John Hewson. He lost that over tax, or fight back, but tax in particular. A bit in the wrong hands, this can go fairly badly wrong.
The final, tax reform of note was the Costello reforms in 2000, introducing, of course, the GST, and we really haven't had anything major since there. This is quite an interesting reform because there isn't really the bipartisan support, even though there had been some level of support for it in the mid-80s within Labor. That, of course, evaporates when the other side of politics is in government. Is that unusual for the tax reforms that Australia has experienced, that we were able to get that through?
No, look, it's another example of an extraordinary partnership. Remember, John Howard has said never ever for a GST, and he's done that on the back of the John Hewson losing the unlosable election in 93. So he then, a bit later, takes over as opposition leader. Then he's in government. So Keating's tried to do the GST in 1985. Keating has won an election opposing the GST in 1993. And now we get to 1998. So the way Howard manages it to say, OK, I said never ever, but we are going to have to consider this and we'll take it to the election. That was his way to say, OK, if we don't get re-elected, well, there'll be no GST. They do take it to the election, and it's again unbelievable kind of effort by Costello and Howard, especially Costello, to sell that reform. This is really hard. There's no point pretending it's kind of, we just explain it and everyone will accept it. And they went to that election, they just got re-elected. It was all about the GST, that election. But they got there, and that sort of completed the Asprey blueprint. Like Asprey had said, do the income tax side, do the consumption tax side. So Keating managed the income tax side, Costello managed the consumption tax side. So
the GST was introduced with a lot of carve-outs, and that was, of course, the price of getting the Democrats, who were sort of key decision-makers in the Senate at that time, their support for this. So a lot of fresh fruit and fresh produce was exempted. So it's always been criticised, our GST, for being a very narrow base and also for being quite low. If you look at, say, comparative countries like, I think, of the UK, theirs is sort of 20-odd%, ours is just 10. No doubt the tax economists are thinking, well, there's a revenue base that we could broaden and rate we could increase. And there's an argument that indirect taxes are a better way to tax the economy than direct taxes because you're not taxing people's efforts.
Well, I think tax economists would sort of quibble over whether there's much difference there. I think the big difference is about how you feel about equity versus efficiency. I think all tax economists would think you probably want more than one tax base in the mix. You want income tax for your progressivity, but you want a good broad-based consumption tax, and other taxes are raising revenue in a relatively simple, efficient way. So I think having the mix, and yes, we are low by OECD standards. Our rate's 10. I think the average OECD is 18 or 19% across the OECD. And the thing about when they introduced the GST, that they left health and education out because they worried about competitiveness between the public and the private sector. Like it doesn't apply to the public sector, it does to the private. So they were left out, and then food got taken out in the negotiations. So we started off initially, they were hoping for a tax base about 2/3 of private consumption. GST now applies to about half of private consumption. But now you think we'd broaden the base, but Peter Costello launched my first book, The Changing Fortunes, A History of the Australian Treasury, and he launched that, and he got asked at that launch about, is it time to because it was 20 years since the GST then, is it time to open it up and broaden the base? And he said, if you open it up, do you think you'll end up with a better or worse outcome? And he was worried if you open it up in the Australian context, you'll end up with a narrower base. So maybe we just be grateful for what we got. Not great. Our base is not out of line with the OECD. We're 50. The OECD averages, it might be 55% or something like that. New Zealand does 100, but all the others are more like us, a bit more than us. It's the rate where we're out of line.
So now we're 2024, it's 24 years since we've introduced the GST. We're all pretty used to it now, and 10%, it's an easy rate to calculate, even for the less mathematically inclined. An 18% rate would be a bit tricky, surely. But
business computer systems.
Well, that's true. I've got calculators, got iPhones. You just work it out, of course. But do we have a burning platform now? I mean, you said it's been 22 years since the first IGR in 2002. They always tell us pretty much the same story. The burning of that platform seems to get more and more rigorous, but yet less and less action seems to be forthcoming. It just doesn't seem to be taken very seriously by the political class, would you say? There has been some intimation that there might be changes around the previous election, negative gearing, but that was political reality of that was, well, the results spoke for themselves, didn't they? It's not an electable strategy. But where are we, Paul, with tax reform for Australia? Do we need another global crisis, a security crisis, to promote some action?
Well, and this is the problem with, and, people like me, ex-Treasury officials are inadequate at articulating the burning platform. I think we do have a burning platform. We're stuck in with an economy that's low growth. We're really struggling to get growth, wages, productivity going. There's the Ken Henry sort of characterisation about the intergenerational tragedy that we're probably headed to the next generation of the one after will probably have lower income than the generation before them. The tax system is closing in on them. Personal income tax is going to be a greater burden on personal income tax with a smaller proportion of the population. Some of our other tax bases are really withering, company tax, excise, some others. And we have these big unused tax bases that other countries make better use of than us around natural resources, the whole greenhouse issue, land, things that are much more efficient tax bases, and we're not utilising them. But the crisis just hasn't maybe we just haven't got the politician, the Paul Keating or the Peter Costello, that can articulate the burning platform. I feel it's there, but it's hard for governments. Governments love telling you how well things are going on their watch. To come out and say, we've got a major problem here, and, well, it sort of reflects on them, or certainly creates an expectation that they'll now fix it. And so it's difficult. I just don't think we've had that for some time in Australia. Now, it's been difficult. We've had very slim majorities for governments, hung parliaments. It's very difficult when you're sitting on a one-seat majority to be brave. But that time will come, and what I'm trying to say in the book is that we need to keep making the arguments, the foundational arguments, so when that political window does open and does present, that at least we, the tax economists, the public finance practitioners, can say, well, look, we've got a broad sort of agenda here, which is broadly agreed, at least in that sort of community.
Well, maybe we, though, need to accept that the government can't provide as many services as we have received today. I mean, that might be the alternative, that people really don't want to pay any more tax, but they're willing to see a withdrawal of some of the level of services and offerings of the government, because the size of the state
that would make sense, but
has grown a lot in you think since the Menzies
not
era.
Really, no, I don't think so.
In terms of the government programs available, I mean, there are.
If you look at the size of government as a proportion of the economy, it's been pretty flat for 40 years. It goes up and down, of course, but no, it's not right that the size of government has been increasing, but the pressures are there. And I guess, Georgina, what I'm kind of worrying, is that it's probably going to go the other way.
So what about the impact of programs like the NDIS, though, that didn't exist even 20 years ago? They require a lot of government revenue to fund, and
I think looking forward, that's the case.
Yes.
Right now, I mean, NDIS is huge, obviously. They did increase the Medicare levy by 0.5 percentage point, but I think it's the looking forward about where NDIS is going, where aged care is going, where health generally is going, where defence is going.
So your point is that the current expenditure on those programs is manageable, but it's the forecasts that point to a very difficult budgetary environment.
Yeah, and I'm certainly not trying to make any comment about a specific program.
Sure.
Governments have to prioritise. All I'm doing is looking at the sort of aggregate data. I can see that the size of government over the last 40 years has been reasonably flat. But looking forward, all the pressures are on the upside. NDIS is the highest growth, I think, but others, aged care, defence, there's a whole lot that the the pressures are just insurmountable. I just can't see a government or society is going to accept to really pull it back. I mean, it looks to me like the reality. So I think we're faced with a situation that we may well have to increase the tax burden. And that is extremely confronting given where we are, and especially if we think it's going to come from personal income tax.
Well, it might not meet your requirements of being efficient, equitable and simple. So thank you so much, Paul, for the discussion today. Such an interesting history of tax reform in Australia. Not notable for its plethora of events, but notable, of course, for the shifting trends in how Australian governments have dealt with the question of tax that, of course, is as certain as our death. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Georgina.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.